Welcome to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and today we're diving into something that I know hits close to home for so many people listening. You've been doing everything right. You're tracking your food, you're exercising, you're staying consistent, and then one day the scale just stops moving. Week after week, you're putting in the same effort, but the results have completely stalled. And suddenly, all that motivation you had, all that discipline that felt so sustainable just a month ago, it evaporates. You find yourself wondering if any of this is even worth it. I'm calling this episode The Plateau Problem, and we're going to spend the next hour really unpacking what the science tells us about why motivation collapses when weight loss stalls, and more importantly, what actually works to reboot it. Not the Instagram inspiration or the just push harder advice that doesn't help anyone, but the evidence based strategies that show up consistently across psychological research. Because here's what the research makes very clear: losing motivation at a weight loss plateau is not a character flaw. It's a well documented psychological phenomenon with identifiable causes and, thankfully, with proven solutions. Let's start with understanding why this happens in the first place, because I think a lot of people beat themselves up for losing motivation when really what's happening is completely predictable given how human psychology works. You'd think that after all the effort you've already invested, after all the habits you've built, after all the progress you've made, you'd be able to maintain that effort even when results temporarily plateau. But that's not how our brains work. Instead, people report this almost complete collapse of motivation that feels way out of proportion to what's actually changed. The behaviors that felt manageable last month suddenly feel impossible this month, and the entire project starts feeling futile. The research on this is pretty clear about the mechanisms, even if they're not particularly flattering to how we'd like to think we operate. Dicker and colleagues published a study in 2021 in the European Journal of Internal Medicine that really nails down what's happening here. They identify that demotivation after stalled weight loss primarily stems from unmet expectations and what they call the collapse of outcome expectancy linkages. Essentially, we engage in weight loss efforts because we expect a particular outcome. We do the work, we see results that reinforces the behavior. But when that outcome stops materializing despite continued effort, our brains interpret this as evidence that the effort outcome relationship has fundamentally broken down. And this isn't irrational, by the way. It's actually a pretty reasonable inference from the brain's perspective. If you do something and get results, you keep doing it. If you keep doing it and stop getting results, questioning whether it's worth continuing makes logical sense. The problem is that weight loss plateaus are often temporary and don't actually mean the effort outcome relationship has permanently broken. But our motivation systems don't know that. They just register effort continuing, results stopped, therefore, effort is no longer effective, time to disengage. There's a really interesting qualitative study from 2025 by Millenniati and colleagues published in the journal Action that digs into women's lived experiences of this demotivation. What emerges from their interviews is this profound sense of betrayal, almost. People describe feeling like their bodies have stopped cooperating, like the implicit contract where effort equals results has been violated. One participant described it as, "I kept my part of the bargain, but my body didn't keep its part." I think that captures something essential about how personal and almost moral this experience becomes. It's not just disappointment about not losing weight, it's feeling fundamentally let down by your own body. The psychological fatigue piece is interesting too, and this comes from the work by Greaves and colleagues in their 2017 systematic review in Health Psychology Review. They identify that it's not just about the lack of results, it's that maintaining weight loss behaviors requires ongoing cognitive resources, what researchers call self regulation effort, and that resource is depletable. You're essentially asking your brain to override its default preferences continuously, to choose the salad when you want the pasta, to go to the gym when you'd rather stay on the couch, to track everything meticulously when that feels tedious and time consuming. When you're seeing results, that self regulation feels worth the effort. The outcomes justify the cognitive cost, but when results stall, suddenly you're depleting this limited resource without the reinforcement that made it feel sustainable. It's like running a business that's no longer profitable. You're still doing all the work, but the return on investment has disappeared, and continuing to pour effort into something that's not working starts feeling increasingly unreasonable. Chu and colleagues published research in 2022 in Public Health Nutrition that identified specific self regulation barriers people report when motivation crashes. Negative self talk becomes pervasive. People start catastrophizing, interpreting the plateau as evidence they'll never reach their goals, that they're fundamentally incapable of succeeding at weight loss. Environmental triggers that they'd been managing successfully suddenly feel overwhelming. The sight of certain foods, social situations involving eating, stress from other life areas, all of these things that they developed strategies for managing become impossible to resist when motivation has collapsed. So that's the bad news. Motivation collapse at weight loss plateaus is common, well documented, and happens for understandable psychological reasons. But here's the good news, and this is really what I want to spend most of our time on today. The research also shows us very clearly what works to reboot that motivation. And I'm not talking about one magic solution because motivation is complex and multifaceted, but there are several evidence based strategies that consistently show positive effects across different studies and populations. Let's start with probably the most robust finding in the research, which is the importance of self efficacy. Self efficacy is your belief in your capability to successfully perform the behaviors necessary to achieve a goal. And the research shows again and again that self efficacy is absolutely central to regaining motivation after a plateau. Dicker's 2021 study that I mentioned earlier found that self efficacy was one of the strongest predictors of whether people could maintain motivation during challenging periods of weight loss. The tricky thing about self efficacy is that it takes a hit when weight loss stalls. You've been doing the behaviors successfully, but they're not producing results anymore, which makes you question whether you're actually capable of succeeding. So, rebuilding self efficacy becomes crucial, and there are specific techniques for doing this that the research supports. One of the most effective approaches is what Millenniati's research calls reflecting on past achievements. This sounds almost too simple to work, but the data supports it. When motivation crashes, people tend to focus exclusively on current lack of results and forget about the progress they've already made. Deliberately reflecting on what you've already accomplished, the weight you've already lost, the habits you've successfully built, the improvements in how you feel or what you can do physically, this actually helps rebuild the belief that you are capable of succeeding at this. Teixeira and colleagues published research in 2015 in BMC Medicine that's really comprehensive on this. They did a systematic review of what they call self regulation mediators in successful weight loss interventions. What they found is that interventions that included components specifically designed to enhance self efficacy were significantly more effective at helping people maintain motivation and continue making progress. And the techniques they identified as effective include things like setting and achieving small, manageable goals so you're creating success experiences, using self monitoring so you have objective evidence of your capability and progress, and what's called mastery experiences, which is basically practicing the skills you need in controlled ways where you can succeed. Goal setting comes up repeatedly in the research as another crucial strategy, but with some important nuances about how to do it effectively. The work by Kwasnicka and colleagues in 2019, published in Psychology and Health, makes it really clear that the way you set goals matters tremendously for motivation maintenance. When weight loss stalls, continuing to pursue the same numeric weight loss goals that you were chasing before the plateau often backfires. You're setting yourself up to repeatedly fail at achieving the goal, which further damages motivation and self efficacy. What the research suggests instead is revisiting and often revising your goals in several specific ways. First, you might shift from outcome goals, which are about the number on the scale, to process goals, which are about the behaviors themselves. So instead of lose 2 pounds this week, which you may have limited control over, the goal becomes track my food intake every day this week, or complete 4 workout sessions this week. These are entirely within your control, which means you can succeed at them even during a plateau, and those success experiences help maintain motivation and self efficacy. Second, the research supports what's called goal adjustment or goal flexibility. This is recognizing when a goal isn't serving you well anymore and deliberately changing it rather than rigidly sticking to something that's no longer working. For some people at a plateau, this might mean temporarily shifting focus from weight loss to maintenance, making the goal maintain my current weight while continuing healthy behaviors. For others, it might mean broadening goals to include non scale victories, things like fitness improvements, how clothes fit, energy levels, health markers like blood pressure or blood sugar. Greaves' 2017 systematic review found that people who maintained weight loss long term tended to have this kind of goal flexibility. They could adapt their goals based on changing circumstances rather than giving up entirely when the original goal became temporarily unachievable. The people who struggled were more likely to have this all or nothing thinking, where if they weren't losing weight, they considered themselves failures and abandoned the effort entirely. Now, let me talk about social support because this is another area where the research is really consistent and strong. Dicker's 2021 study found that positive interactions with healthcare professionals and the presence of social support networks significantly increased both motivation and adherence to weight loss efforts. Millenniati's qualitative research from 2025 echoes this, with participants reporting that feeling understood and encouraged by others was crucial for overcoming demotivation. But here's what's interesting: not all social support is equally helpful. The research distinguishes between what you might call informational support, which is advice and guidance, and emotional support, which is empathy and encouragement, and what's called instrumental support, which is practical help with the actual behaviors. For rebooting motivation specifically, emotional support seems to be particularly important. People need to feel less isolated in their struggle, to know that what they're experiencing is normal and doesn't mean they're failing. Phelan and colleagues published research in 2020 in the journal Obesity that looked at long term weight loss maintainers, people who'd successfully kept weight off, and asked them what strategies they used. Social support and accountability came up repeatedly, but what was interesting is that the most effective support wasn't people giving advice or telling them what to do. It was people who provided encouragement, who shared similar experiences, who helped them feel less alone in the struggle. Group based interventions seem to be particularly effective for this reason. Yang and Lee published research in 2021 in Technological Forecasting and Social Change that looked at the effects of social networks on weight loss motivation. They found that being part of a group where members shared experiences, encouraged each other, and celebrated each other's progress, even non scale progress, significantly enhanced motivation and adherence. There's something powerful about knowing you're not the only one finding this hard, that other people are facing similar challenges and continuing anyway. Healthcare professional support matters too, but again with nuances. Matthews and colleagues did research in 2017 published in BMJ Open that found that the quality of interaction with healthcare professionals mattered more than just the fact of having professional support. When healthcare professionals showed understanding of the psychological challenges, provided encouragement rather than just instruction, and helped patients feel capable rather than inadequate, that support enhanced motivation. When interactions felt judgmental or dismissive of the difficulty of the task, they could actually undermine motivation further. Let me shift to talking about some of the cognitive and behavioral techniques that research shows can help reboot motivation. Cognitive behavioral approaches and something called motivational interviewing come up repeatedly in the literature as effective. Kamsa and colleagues published a meta analysis in 2020 in Behavior Research and Therapy that looked at cognitive behavioral interventions for weight loss across multiple randomized controlled trials. What they found is that CBT approaches, especially when tailored to individual needs, significantly enhanced both motivation and actual weight loss outcomes. What does cognitive behavioral work look like in this context? A lot of it is about identifying and challenging the negative thought patterns that emerge when weight loss stalls, things like catastrophizing, where you interpret the plateau as evidence you'll never succeed, all or nothing thinking, where if you're not actively losing weight, you consider yourself a failure, overgeneralization, where one plateau means you're incapable of weight loss permanently. These thinking patterns are incredibly common and they absolutely tank motivation. CBT based interventions teach people to recognize these thoughts, examine the evidence for and against them, and develop more balanced, realistic alternatives. So instead of, I've hit a plateau, this will never work, I should just give up, you'd work towards something like, I've hit a plateau, which research shows is normal and often temporary. I've already lost X pounds, which proves I'm capable of this. I can continue my behaviors even without seeing immediate results, and historically, that's what leads to breaking through plateaus. Carrells and colleagues published research in 2007 in Health Psychology that looked specifically at motivational interviewing as a supplement to obesity treatment. Motivational interviewing is this counseling approach that focuses on exploring and resolving ambivalence about behavior change. When motivation crashes at a plateau, you're often experiencing intense ambivalence. Part of you wants to continue, part of you wants to quit. You can see reasons to keep going, but also compelling reasons to stop. Motivational interviewing helps people work through that ambivalence by exploring both sides without judgment, clarifying personal values and goals, and ultimately supporting autonomous decision making about whether and how to continue. The research shows this approach is more effective than just telling people what they should do or trying to convince them to keep going. It respects their autonomy while helping them connect behavior to what matters to them, which is ultimately more motivating than external pressure. Let's talk about digital interventions and self monitoring, because this is an area where there's been a lot of research in recent years. Asbjornson and colleagues published a scoping review in 2019 in the Journal of Medical Internet Research that looked at how digital health interventions could support weight loss, maintenance, and motivation. They found that mobile apps, activity trackers, online platforms, basically digital tools that facilitate self monitoring, goal setting, and feedback, were linked to improved motivation and better weight loss maintenance. But, and this is important, not all digital tools are equally effective. Pagotto and colleagues did research in 2013, published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, that looked at weight loss apps specifically. What they found is that the apps that were most effective included evidence based behavioral strategies, not just tracking features. Things like goal setting tools, feedback mechanisms, social support features, educational content about behavior change. These elements enhanced the effectiveness significantly. Kwasnicka's 2019 research found that self monitoring itself, whether digital or analog, helped people maintain motivation during plateaus because it provided objective evidence of their behaviors. When you're not seeing scale results, it's easy to start thinking you're not actually doing the work or that your efforts don't matter. But self monitoring data shows you concretely, here are all the days I tracked my food. Here are all the workouts I completed. Here's evidence that I am doing what I set out to do, even if the scale isn't reflecting it yet. The gamification elements that Yang and Lee studied in their 2021 research can also enhance engagement and motivation. Things like achievement badges, progress visualizations, challenges and competitions, social sharing of accomplishments. The research shows these elements can make the process more engaging and provide alternative sources of reinforcement when scale results aren't available. You're getting points or badges or social recognition for the behaviors themselves, which helps maintain motivation independent of weight outcomes. Chatterjee and colleagues did a systematic review in 2021, published in the Journal of Medical Internet Research, looking at digital interventions for healthy lifestyle management more broadly. They found that personalized feedback and reminders were particularly effective features. Getting a notification saying, "You've logged food for 7 days straight, great consistency," provides reinforcement that isn't dependent on weight loss. Having the app remind you of your goals or planned behaviors helps maintain the focus and commitment even when motivation is low. Now, I want to spend some time talking about habits and what the research says about the role of old habits in weight loss maintenance, because this is something that doesn't always get the attention it deserves. Gardner and colleagues published really interesting research in 2021 in the journal Appetite with a title that I love: Breaking Habits or Breaking Habitual Behaviors. Old Habits as a Neglected Factor in Weight Loss Maintenance. Their argument, supported by their data, is that weight loss interventions often focus on building new healthy habits, things like regular exercise or meal planning, but they tend to neglect the fact that people already have established habits around eating and activity that are in direct competition with these new behaviors. And these old habits don't just disappear, they remain latent, ready to be reactivated, especially during periods of stress or when motivation is low. This matters for motivation specifically because when you hit a plateau and motivation drops, you're suddenly much more vulnerable to those old habitual patterns reasserting themselves. The new behaviors you've been practicing require conscious effort and motivation to maintain. The old behaviors are automatic, require no effort, and may be strongly associated with emotional comfort or stress relief. So when motivation crashes, people often find themselves reverting to old patterns almost without realizing it, which then creates additional guilt and further undermines motivation. Gardner's research suggests that interventions need to specifically address these old habits, not just build new ones. This might involve identifying the cues that trigger old eating or activity patterns and actively disrupting those cue behavior associations. It might mean consciously replacing old habits with new ones rather than just trying to add new behaviors. It might involve environmental restructuring to remove the cues for old habits or make them harder to enact. Spreckley and colleagues published a systematic review in 2021 in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies on Health and Well-Being that looked at experiences of successful substantial long-term weight loss maintenance. One theme that emerged consistently was the importance of managing setbacks and what they called relapse management. People who maintained weight loss long term had explicit strategies for handling periods when motivation dropped or when they found themselves reverting to old patterns. These strategies often included things like having a plan for what to do when motivation crashes rather than waiting for it to happen and trying to figure it out in the moment. Having specific behaviors they would go back to as a minimum, even if they couldn't maintain everything. Having support people they would reach out to. Having ways of catching themselves early when they started sliding back into old patterns rather than waiting until they'd completely abandoned the new behaviors. Teixeira's 2015 systematic review in BMC Medicine emphasizes that relapse management planning is actually a key mediator of successful behavior change in obesity interventions. It's not about never experiencing setbacks or motivation drops. It's about having robust strategies for managing those inevitable challenges when they arise. Let me talk about something that might sound counterintuitive, but comes up in the research as potentially helpful for some people, and that's taking a structured break. Heel Cohen and colleagues published research in 2025 in clinical psychology and psychotherapy looking at relapse experiences. And one finding that emerged is that for some people, Continuing to push when motivation has completely collapsed can lead to total abandonment of efforts, whereas intentionally taking a structured break, a planned period of weight maintenance rather than weight loss, can actually prevent that complete disengagement. The idea here is that instead of fighting against cratered motivation and forcing yourself to continue pursuing aggressive weight loss when everything feels impossible, you make a deliberate decision to shift into maintenance mode for a defined period. You're not abandoning the healthy behaviors entirely. You're just removing the pressure of ongoing weight loss as the goal, which can reduce the psychological burden and cognitive fatigue that Greaves identified in their research. Hayes and colleagues published a preliminary randomized controlled trial in 2025 in the Journal of Behavioral Medicine, looking at a brief coaching intervention to reverse weight regain during weight loss maintenance. What they found is that early intervention when people start to regain weight can prevent the complete motivational collapse that often follows. The intervention involved helping people recognize early warning signs, adjust goals and expectations, reconnect with their reasons for pursuing weight loss, and develop renewed plans for moving forward. This gets at something important about timing. The research suggests that intervention works better when it happens early, when motivation is dropping but hasn't completely disappeared, rather than waiting until someone has fully disengaged. This might mean having check in points, regular times when you assess how motivation is doing and whether you need to make adjustments, rather than waiting for a crisis. Tay and colleagues published research in 2023 in the journal Nutrients that specifically looked at barriers and facilitators of weight loss and weight loss maintenance through qualitative research. What they found is that people who successfully maintained motivation during difficult periods tended to have revisited their initial reasons for wanting to lose weight. They'd reconnected with their why, whether that was health concerns, wanting to be active with grandchildren, improving quality of life, whatever the underlying motivation was beyond just the number on the scale. This matters because when weight loss stalls, it's easy to lose sight of those broader reasons and become fixated on the scale number itself. Deliberately revisiting why you started this process, what you hope to gain beyond just weighing less, can help revive motivation that's been damaged by the plateau, particularly if some of those hoped for benefits have actually been achieved even without continued weight loss. Maybe you're more active, or your blood pressure has improved, or you have more energy, or your clothes fit better. These outcomes can serve as alternative sources of motivation when the scale isn't cooperating. Palmyra and colleagues published research in 2022 in the British Journal of Health Psychology looking at reciprocal effects between motivation and self efficacy during a weight regain prevention program. What they found is that these factors influence each other over time. When self efficacy increases, motivation tends to increase as well. When motivation increases, that often leads to more success experiences which boost self efficacy. This creates the potential for positive feedback loops where interventions targeting either factor can have beneficial effects on both. This means that when you're trying to reboot motivation after a plateau, you might approach it from multiple angles simultaneously. Working on rebuilding self efficacy through the techniques we discussed earlier, while also using goal revision and social support to directly address motivation, while also employing cognitive behavioral strategies to manage the negative thinking, and using self monitoring for objective evidence of your efforts. The research suggests these strategies work synergistically rather than being mutually exclusive options. Trujillo Garrido and Santicano published research in 2022 in the journal Nutrients, looking specifically at motivation and limiting factors for adherence to weight loss interventions in primary care. They found that barriers to motivation weren't uniform across people. Different individuals struggled with different specific barriers, things like time constraints, emotional eating triggers, lack of social support, difficulty with certain behaviors. This suggests that effective motivation rebooting probably needs to be somewhat personalized based on individual barriers and facilitators rather than one size fits all. This gets supported by other research too. Choose 2022 study in public health nutrition used thematic framework analysis to understand personal motivation, self regulation barriers, and strategies in people with overweight and obesity. What emerged is that while there are common themes, the specific manifestation varies substantially between individuals. Some people's motivation crashes primarily due to psychological factors like perfectionism or negative self talk. Others face more practical barriers like environmental triggers or lack of social support. Still others struggle with what they identified as low distress tolerance, difficulty sitting with the discomfort of not seeing results. This matters because it suggests that effective intervention might need assessment of what specifically is undermining motivation for a particular person, and then tailored strategies addressing those specific issues. The good news is that the research has identified effective strategies for all of these different barriers. The challenge is figuring out which combination is most relevant for a given individual at a given time. Let me talk briefly about some of what the research identifies as less helpful or potentially counterproductive when motivation has crashed. Greaves' 2017 systematic review found that strategies focused on willpower or self discipline alone tended to be ineffective for motivation maintenance. When people conceptualized weight loss primarily as a test of willpower and then experienced a plateau, they interpreted that as evidence of personal weakness, which further damaged motivation rather than helping restore it. Similarly, overly restrictive approaches or aggressive calorie cutting often backfired. When motivation is already low, making the behaviors more difficult or more depriving tends to accelerate disengagement rather than helping people push through. The research suggests that sometimes the answer to a plateau is actually loosening restrictions slightly or making behaviors less burdensome so they're more sustainable when motivation is compromised. External pressure, whether from healthcare professionals or family members or even social media, tends to be ineffective or counterproductive for motivation restoration. Patel's 2019 systematic review in preventive medicine looking at motivational interviewing in e-health and telehealth interventions found that approaches respecting autonomy and self-direction were more effective than directive or pressuring approaches. People need to feel they're making their own choices about how to proceed rather than being coerced or guilted into continuing. Research by Solbrig and colleagues published in 2018 in the International Journal of Obesity compared functional imagery training to motivational interviewing for weight loss. They found that techniques helping people vividly imagine and emotionally connect with their goals and desired outcomes were more effective than just talking about them abstractly. This suggests that when motivation crashes, interventions that make goals feel real and emotionally meaningful again, that help people reconnect with what they're working toward in a visceral way, can be particularly powerful for rebooting motivation. As we start wrapping up, I want to emphasize a few key takeaways from all of this research. First, losing motivation when weight loss stalls is normal, common, and psychologically understandable. It's not a character flaw or personal failure. It's a predictable response to a situation where effort outcome relationships have been disrupted. Understanding this can actually help reduce some of the guilt and self-blame that often makes the motivation collapse worse. Second, there are multiple evidence-based strategies for rebooting motivation, and the research suggests that combining several approaches is generally more effective than relying on any single strategy. Self-efficacy building, goal revision, social support, cognitive behavioral techniques, self-monitoring, habit management, all of these have research support, and they work through somewhat different mechanisms, which means they can complement each other. Third, personalization matters. Not every strategy will resonate with or be effective for every person. Part of the process is figuring out which approaches work for you, what your specific barriers are, and tailoring your motivation rebooting efforts accordingly. The research gives us a toolkit of options, but individuals need to find the right combination for their situation. Fourth, timing matters. Earlier intervention, before motivation has completely collapsed and before you fully disengage from behaviors, tends to be more effective than waiting until you're in crisis. This suggests building in regular checkpoints to assess how motivation is doing and make adjustments proactively rather than reactively. And finally, the research makes clear that weight loss maintenance is not about achieving perfect motivation that never falters. It's about having robust strategies for managing the inevitable periods when motivation drops. The people who succeed long term aren't the ones who never experience motivation crashes. They're the ones who have effective ways of managing those crashes when they occur so they don't lead to complete disengagement. If you're currently experiencing a motivation crash at a weight loss plateau, I hope this episode has given you some concrete, research backed options for moving forward. Start by being compassionate with yourself about the fact that this is happening. It's normal. Then consider which of these strategies might be most relevant for your situation. Maybe you need to work on self efficacy building by reflecting on what you've already achieved. Maybe you need to revise your goals to focus on behaviors rather than outcomes. Maybe you need to reach out for social support or professional help. Maybe you need to address the negative thinking patterns that are undermining your efforts. The research tells us that motivation can be rebooted, that these plateaus can be overcome, and that there are evidence based paths forward. It won't necessarily be easy, and it might require trying several different strategies to find what works for you. But the data supports that it's absolutely possible to restore motivation and continue making progress toward your goals, even after the most discouraging plateau. That's what we've got for today's episode of Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and I'll be back next week with another deep dive into what research tells us about behavior change and health. Until then, be kind to yourself. Remember that struggles with motivation are part of the process rather than evidence of failure, and keep taking those strides toward your solutions.